When I duck this way, I'm looking at the camera. And here we are, the very lovely Dr. Zoe Schaedel from my clinic, and we are talking about sleep. Now, we're talking about a lot of interesting things about sleep today because there have been some really interesting bits and pieces that have come out about, things just beyond sleep, about dreams and all of those sorts of weird and wacky things about how they can impact on our health. But before we get to those, why is sleep so important and what does it actually do for us?
So I think we used to think of sleep as a time when we were just really passive, kind of resting overnight, letting things recover. But what we know now is that there are so many important processes that occur overnight. So it actually impacts on all of our body systems. Everything has a process that occurs during the night. And I think it's also a lot to do with our circadian rhythm. So we know more, don't we? We're hearing more and more about how our circadian rhythm affects things. But what we know is we're programmed to do certain things at night. So, for instance, we're programmed to kind of consolidate our memories and our learning. And without sleep, we don't do that very well in the day. We don't hold on to our memories. Our cardiovascular system is regulated by sleep. And if we don't get enough sleep, we're at higher risk of things like cardiovascular disease. Also, a lot of our metabolic processes are controlled while we're asleep. So it regulates the release of our kind of weight management hormones. All that happens while we're in deep sleep overnight. And I think what we often see when we're thinking about menopause as well is the impact on our mental health. So our mental health absolutely depends on our sleep. It is such an important relationship. And during the different stages of sleep, we get different kind of benefits. But one of them is that in particular, in rapid eye movement sleep, it's a time when we have lots of emotional regulation. So there are different stages of sleep, and we can talk about those in relation to dreams as well. But in rapid eye movement sleep, we take really difficult memories, things that have happened to us in the day that might be tricky, and we just kind of smooth them out and sort of make connections with them and make them less traumatic. And if we don't get enough sleep, we end up feeling more anxious, more, lower in mood, more likely to feel kind of irritable, short-tempered, all those sorts of things. So I think it's such an important thing to try and get right, particularly if we've got other challenges like perimenopause and menopause as well.
With the REM sleep, we do that 3 or 4 times during the night, yeah? What are the things that can impact on REM sleep that would make that a poorer quality REM sleep?
Yeah, so REM sleep is where we have rapid eye movements, and it's just one of the 4 stages of sleep. And actually, we need all 4 stages to have good quality sleep. And like you say, we move through them in different cycles. They last about 90 minutes each, and we start from being awake, we go into kind of light sleep called stage N1, and then move into stage N2, which is also relatively light sleep. But some important things are happening at those times. So, for instance, the heart rate slows down a bit, our breathing rate slows down, our temperature drops. It's really relaxing the muscles at this time. And then we hit a really important part of sleep called deep, slow wave sleep. And that's the really deepest of the sleep. And that's called N3. So we've moved from 1, 2 to 3. And in N3, that's where we get loads of that kind of memory consolidation. And we move things that we've learned in the day into our kind of memory storage banks in that deep sleep. And we also think that at that time, there's a kind of washing out of waste products of the brain. And this is really important. It's actually only discovered relatively recently, something called the glymphatic system, where we take kind of waste products, proteins that have been kind of built up in the day, and we get rid of them in deep sleep. Now,
when you say proteins, are we talking things there like the amyloids and the tau proteins and those sorts of things that are associated with dementia, or are we talking about an amino acid from this piece of steak you had for lunch?
Yeah, well, a bit of both, but it's the beta amyloid and the tau in particular that really helped to make the link between people that were getting a lack of sleep, lack of deep sleep in particular, and an increased risk of developing dementia. And then they could see on MRI scans that actually there were these differences in the protein levels, and that really helped to understand the kind of really important function of that deep sleep.
All right.
And
I'll come back to that. So let me finish off those 4 phases, because I'll come back to that. So it really boils down to the duration of your sleep as well.
Yeah. And so in all of those 3 stages, they're called the non-rapid eye movement stages. That's why they've got the N in their title. And then at the end of each sleep cycle, you get something called rapid eye movement sleep. And that's really interesting because the whole body actually becomes paralyzed at that time. So you can't move anything other than your eyes. So it's a really interesting phase of sleep. And the interesting thing is, if you put kind of electrodes on the brain and look at what's going on, it's incredibly active at that time. So it's very difficult to tell the difference between when you're sleeping in rapid eye movement sleep and when you're awake. It's such an active time for your brain, but not for your body, because your body can't move at all. And the only things that can move are the eyes. And so they're the only kind of muscles that are spared. So you get lots of these random eye movements.
One of the questions that did come in actually was about sleep paralysis while you're there. So is there a correlation between the REM phase and sleep paralysis, or are they 2 entirely different things?
No, there is a correlation, and often it's when you're coming exactly out of this paralysis from REM sleep, but the brain doesn't catch up with itself. So your body remains paralyzed, but your brain has moved out of that phase of sleep. And so you really can't move your body, but you become conscious. And it's so frightening, but it's actually quite common. We do see it a lot, and you can have that more even with, stress and anxiety, things like that. You can get more episodes of sleep paralysis.
That was the question. How do you prevent?
So there is something about, thinking about whether there's anything going on that might have made that happen a bit more. But if you are having sleep paralysis commonly, make sure that you've spoken to a doctor about it, because it's sometimes a sign of other things. And so it's really important to get that checked out. But not to worry too much, because it happens a lot. People do experience a lot, but if it's happening a lot, do get that checked out by a doctor.
Yeah, because that really would be freaky. How long does it last for, really, if you sort of wake
up?
Often
it's only a couple of seconds even, you can't move, but it can go on for minutes, and it can be really distressing.
Yeah. Question there is basically, how much sleep do we need each night? Because this is the thing that makes people quite anxious, isn't it? Because we're always told we need 8 hours sleep, and if you're getting less, then it's not good. And does it really matter? I mean, do some people survive very well on a shorter period of sleep, and do others naturally need 9 to 10? Or really, is it sort of basically it's quite a narrow definition?
So it does vary between individuals. So you can't say one number will suit everybody. But we do think that most people would benefit from somewhere between 7 to 9 hours. So it depends on your age. So when you're a toddler, when you're a child, you need more sleep. But as we get older, the amount of sleep that we get does reduce a little bit. But for adults, the recommendation is that for most people, you need to get somewhere between 7 and 9 hours. There's actually a really lovely chart on the Sleep Health Foundation website. And it shows these kind of train tracks saying between 7 and 9 hours is what most people need. But some people, it has a kind of outer band. Some people might be fine with 6 hours or with 10 hours. And so you've got to kind of work out what's right for you. But the majority of people do need somewhere between 7 to 9 hours. And I think the importance of that is knowing all those important processes that go on. And we can't just say, oh, it's okay. I'll sleep when I'm dead. I'll just stay up. I'll do all the things I want to do. I'll live a full life, because it is important. So, but again, if you're there's lots of people that just say, I just know I need about 6.5 hours, and then I feel fine. And so the most important thing is how you feel. So if you feel well rested.
Does it matter if that, because this is the other thing too, one of the questions that came in as well was sort of, I quite regularly wake up 1 or 2 times a night, but I may well be getting the 8 hours, but I'm waking up a couple of times a night. Does that matter?
So no, probably not. It depends. But no, it doesn't matter if you wake in the night, because actually, when I was talking about those sleep cycles, so when you move through the 4 stages of sleep, you come up every 90 minutes into quite a light phase of sleep from rapid eye movement. And actually, it's really common to wake. So it's completely normal to wake at intervals during the night. And actually, as we evolved, that was probably quite a useful thing, these little checks just to make sure we're still safe. So that's completely normal. I think where it isn't normal and where it might be a problem is if it feels distressing. So if you are awake for a long time, you struggle to get back to sleep, it's creating stress, it's creating anxiety for you, often that will affect you the next day and it has an impact. And I think even for people who are getting a good 7 hours sleep, but they're up for 2 hours here and 1 hour there, the quality of the sleep just isn't good enough to feel really well and feel rested. And so that is, that's something to try and treat. But if you're up, you feel fine, you go back to sleep relatively easily, and you're getting a good number of hours, a good quantity, then it's absolutely fine. And actually some people, there are cultures where you might be awake in the middle of the night and you might do yoga, and that can be completely fine. And so it's not always that feels a problem to people.
Now, question here. With perimenopause, if you're waking up with a surge of anxiety, what's causing that? Could it be a shift in adrenaline or cortisol, or is it some other hormone? And I guess that goes with, you were saying that if you are waking up feeling anxious or whatever, what's going on, and how do you bring it down?
Yeah. So there's all sorts of things that might go on. So we do think are kind of the parts of the body that produce adrenaline and cortisol, that whole system is a bit more sensitive in the menopause. So we know that when the estrogen varies, also we can be more likely to produce lots of adrenaline and cortisol at that time. So it may be something related to that. And we know that when you do wake and you feel that anxiety, often adrenaline and cortisol levels are quite high. But what's often underlying that, we have to kind of take it apart and have a look at the whole picture. And I think firstly, it would be really important to think about how you're doing in the perimenopause and menopause. Are you having any symptoms? Because, for instance, if you're having any temperature changes overnight, even if you're not that conscious of it, any temperature changes at all can be really affect the sleep and really bring you up and wake you up. So that's something to think about. And also, it's how you feel kind of in the daytime and on going to bed that really matters. So if you are experiencing any anxiety or stress, if you're worried and you're carrying thoughts from the daytime into the nighttime, they are very likely to then come out. So you might wake for a completely unrelated reason. You might wake just because you're coming out of a sleep cycle, or there's been a temperature change or a noise outside you don't know. But because you are carrying that kind of anxiety and stress, it comes right up and it really shows itself at that time. Part of the brain that isn't very active at night is the prefrontal cortex, which is the kind of really logical part of the brain that keeps us thinking sensibly, keep us on track. And that's quite a lazy part of the brain. It doesn't activate when we wake up at night. And so our kind of adrenaline, cortisol, our anxiety can really come to the fore. And I think that that's an extremely common experience for women waking in the perimenopause and menopause.
Yeah, absolutely. Something she's just saying here, another person saying, you've got this now on Everall, but struggling with post-flu exhaustion, so anxious, waking at 4 a.m, full of anxiety. Anything that I can do, as it's not helping me to recover.
Yeah, well, I know, I can see that. I think this is the problem, isn't it? Everything to do with poor sleep makes everything else harder. It can make it harder to recover from other illnesses, and it can make those other menopause symptoms much more difficult as well. So the types of things that you need to think about are, there are some things that we call sleep hygiene. And I think it's always just good to check in with what you're doing. They might not be the answer. They might not be the cause. It might be something you've been doing for ages and have always been fine, but it's always worth thinking about. So making sure that you're not having caffeine. So a little bit of caffeine in the morning is absolutely fine, but anything later on in the day can disrupt the sleep, and it can make it more likely to wake and get in the way of that really good quality sleep. So have a look at that. Alcohol is another thing.
Until 11 o'clock at night.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's very tricky. I think alcohol is another thing that often people turn to when they're not sleeping well, because you're feeling so frazzled. It kind of helps you fall asleep at night, but that's another thing. And I think if you feel as though your sleep hygiene is pretty good, you're not, I think most people know those kind of basic sleep tips. then it's all about thinking about what you're going to do when you wake up. And there's lots of kind of cognitive things that we can practice and do to help just quiet the mind and bring everything down in the early hours of the morning. I think different exercises are good for different people, but certainly things like breathing exercises can be really good. So, just really bringing down the heart rate, slowing down the breathing rate, sends signals to your brain. Safety. What did you do?
Sorry, my phone just fell over.
Oh,
it had a moment all of its own.
Standing on the head on Instagram.
Yep, exactly. Yep, it had a moment. There we go. Back to normal. Sorry, it's just as you were relaxing and getting us down.
Yes, exactly. Settling everything down.
Yep. All right. So we're lowering our breath. We're breathing deeply. We're relaxing. The other thing actually that I found really useful, and it was actually Simone Stokes, who's a clinical psychologist as well, was recommending. She said that what she found, and I'd actually simultaneously found this myself, is when you're stressed and you're trying to go to sleep and your eyes are rapidly moving, not because you are in rapid eye movement, but just actually concentrating on taking your eyes down and not moving them. And it actually really helps you get back to sleep.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
That also makes me think about reading, because there's just reading a book is also simulating that kind of similar movement that you need to get, that you have in your sleep. So I think there is something about using your eyes and using eye movements. That's really interesting. And some people find reading really soothing.
I think it's like a lot of mindfulness actually to it in there, because it's actually a real effort to stop your eyes from moving. For the first couple of years, you think this isn't working. Then after a while, actually, you do actually keep them still, and then you just find you're gone.
So what do you say to yourself when you do that, Fiona? What are you asking your eyes to do?
Just looking down, basically, with my eyes, just looking down and not moving.
Yeah,
it's really hard.
That's really interesting, because I wonder as well, a bit like you said, is there something about that is it's changing your focus. Yeah. So when you're feeling so anxious in the middle of the night, and it is such a ghastly feeling, especially if you know you've got to get up and you've got to do something, all of these feelings kind of create even more anxiety and stress in your body, and you get more adrenaline and more cortisol. And what we really want you to do is take your brain off itself, stop focusing on those things. And so I think probably focusing really strongly on getting your eyes down and still, in a way, whatever it's doing with the eyes, it's that focus, it's totally taking you out of your head. And I think that's so important. And I think the other thing to say is we try so hard, we feel absolutely desperate, but trying hard to sleep is like the worst thing that you can do. The more effort you put in, and that sounds so hard because you desperately want to go back to sleep. So I think it's about trying to find something that your brain can do to focus on that isn't about sleep, and stop making efforts. And I think if I wake up in the middle of the night and I practice some of these things to see what it's like, I take myself on a bit of a visual journey. So a bit of visualization can be good. And that we know that seeing images, lots of people can't, but some people love that. And thinking through images in really great detail, like a walk that you've done down to the sea, and you think about how it smells, what you can hear, what it feels like. If we're thinking about visual pictures, our brain is much slower than if we're thinking about words and numbers. So I think if you can think of a visualization, that's another thing. So we've got breathing techniques are great. You can Google diaphragmatic breathing, visualization, something like you've said, really focusing on something that's outside of your brain. And then the last thing is not to stay in bed feeling awful. And so it is much, much better to say, I don't think I'm going to go to sleep. I'm feeling awful. I'm going to get up and I'm going to just do something else and just change the subject. Just get up and say, I'm just going to go downstairs. I'm going to do something, listen to a podcast, do something different. And all you're just changing the focus. And actually, once things have stopped, settled down a little bit, you're probably going to be able to go back and hopefully get some sleep.
Yeah. The exercises, the things that we do before we go to bed matter as well, don't they? And Sasha here was saying a minute ago that exercise works really well for her, but other things like getting up, getting light in the morning and things like that, just little things. So even if it doesn't mean you have to go for a 40k run around your local park, but just sort of looking outside at least might make a bit of a difference.
great for trying to train the circadian rhythm. So we are actually meant to sleep really well. And so our body is set up that we're going to be awake in the day and asleep at night. And when it gets out of this picture, we really need to remind itself. And so what we're doing with the light really is working on melatonin, which is this hormone that's produced from the pineal gland in the brain. And we produce a kind of melatonin signal about an hour or two before we go to sleep at night. And it's kind of linked to darkness. And when we wake up in the morning, the signal drops, but we can really enhance that kind of transition by seeing natural light. And as soon as we can see natural light in the morning, being outside is absolutely brilliant. And ideally sort of 15, 20 minutes, but even a little bit works really well. And it just gives signals to the brain to stop the melatonin production. And then that really helps to kind of say, this is the end. And the beginning for melatonin is in the evening when I need to set myself up for going to bed. And again, then you can kind of, it's not a hack, but you can kind of encourage melatonin by dimming the lights and not having really, really bright light at night. So in the hour before you go to bed, to try and dim the lights in your house, not to have really bright lights, can really help with that melatonin production as well. And the other thing that the circadian rhythm really loves is temperature. So if you can have a cooler bedroom, the cooler the better for sleep, or have a really hot shower or bath before you go to bed, and it kind of encourages heat to be released from your body. All of those things are kind of optimizing that rhythm for sleep.
So I'm guessing then that as much as people love the electric blankets, that's probably not necessarily a good idea for a good night's sleep.
No.
It's a shame. Going back to, on that note then, okay, the REM sleep, when we're doing our rapid eye movement, given that it is actually so important as well as that deep thing, what are the things that reduce the quality of that, and what are the things that can improve it?
Yeah, so we've mentioned a couple of them already. So alcohol can impact on that. Certain medications can. But actually, one of the things that we know is that having really bad dreams and nightmares. So in rapid eye movement sleep, that's where we get the most vivid types of dreams. So we can dream anywhere through the night, but the types of dreams that we kind of remember, the things that, weird stuff happens, or it's really brings up a memory the next day, is usually in that rapid eye movement sleep. And when we have nightmares, and I suppose it's often related to trauma, anxiety, stress, all of those things, we know if someone's stressed, they're much more likely to experience nightmares. And that can disrupt the quality of sleep. So and a nightmare is quite different from a bad dream. So we'll have all sorts of dreams. Some are good, some are just neutral, some are bad. But a nightmare is where it's usually so bad, it wakes you up from sleep because you really want to get out of it. And we know that, the people that have nightmares often have that disruption in that quality of their sleep. And actually, there are some things you can do. So you found this you sent me a really interesting study, didn't you?
Because this is just before we get to that. They've linked nightmares to Parkinson's disease and now to dementia. So that's why we're onto this. And so we sort of think, what can you do about it? So why are they linked to those types of brain diseases?
Yeah.
And what can you do to bring that risk down then? I mean, not saying they caused the disease, but it's just that they found a link between.
Yeah. So it's relatively new science. And what that study that you'd noticed found, and some other studies show, is that if you have nightmares quite frequently, so we're talking about once a week, and again, it's not uncommon, so about 5% of the population will have nightmares about once a week. But if you do have them more commonly, you're more likely to be diagnosed with cognitive impairment or with Parkinson's disease in the future. And there's still quite a lot of speculation as to why. So like you said, we don't necessarily think the nightmare is the cause of those problems, but we think, could it be something to do with, we know that there's probably lots of changes in the brain in the early stages of Parkinson's and dementia that before we know, and something to do with the changes in the brain actually also affecting the way that we dream. So that's kind of one theory. The other theory is that it's all related to trauma again, that actually we know you're more likely to develop dementia if you've experienced trauma, if you've got PTSD. And we know you're more likely to have nightmares if you have PTSD as well. So is there something that sort of links the two. Is that the link? So we don't know. But what we do know is you can do some things to reduce your having nightmares if you're troubled by them, if you're having nightmares and you want to reduce them. And there are some really interesting techniques, but the one that's had the most evidence behind it is this thing called imagery rehearsal therapy. And the idea is that you can basically change the course of your nightmares yourself. And the important thing is that you need to try and recall what's going on. And normally, quite soon after a nightmare, if you wake up, you're going to remember it. You might forget it a little bit later, but you try and remember it. And often that means you're going to write it down. But actually, later on in the day, what you want to do is take that story and change it. So you do this while you're conscious, while you're awake. You go through that story, the really awful thing that happened, the thing that made you wake up, because normally you wake up at a time you really want to escape from it. And you give yourself a completely different ending. So you might take characters that were there and make them less scary, make them into cuddly animals or whatever it is, just change the nature. And then the things that are going wrong, you can give them a twist, a different perspective. Actually, it's been shown to be incredibly effective. So you can do this for yourself. If you are really struggling with them, it's probably better to see someone and do some work on them with a specialist. But you can do it yourself and you can try it out. And it's really effective. If you do this for yourself in the day and you talk yourself in detail through the dream being different, it can really reduce the risk of having that nightmare again or a nightmare again. And it can also help reduce PTSD symptoms, interestingly. It can be have quite a profound effect.
Yeah, it's really interesting, actually, isn't it? I mean, I'm just thinking about, I had the weirdest dream a couple of weeks ago. I hate spiders. I mean, I literally cannot bear them. I remember at school, people used to say to me, to try and see how fast I could get my clothes off, they'd say, there's a spider on your shoulder, and I'd be stripped in about a fraction of a second. They thought that was hysterically funny. I hate them. So I had this dream that there was this pipe above me with a giant funnel web spider in it. And by the end of the thing, I was teaching the funnel web spider how to use a computer.
That's amazing.
Where the hell did that come from? But
that's amazing.
It was an active process actually during that, thinking, I have to turn this dream around. And that was actually while I was thinking about how I'm going to turn it into
a Fiona, that's amazing. That brings me on to two thoughts. So the first thought is about actually what are dreams there to do? So we still don't really know. So dreams could just be a waste product of the activity of sleeping. We don't know they've got any real purpose, but they could. There are lots of theories. Like Freud had a theory that it's like wish fulfillment, but that's been kind of disproved. But there are lots of theories that actually, do dreams give us a kind of way of acting something out in a safe environment that helps protect us from threats in the future? Like, does it actually have a purpose to kind of take us through like a rehearsal for something tricky? And so we don't know, but maybe yours was to try and help you figure the spider thing out. You've actually got a really good, if you can get them computer programming, you're fine.
Because that's what you need, a room full of funnel web spiders on a computer.
But the second thing, and I'm so fascinated that you said you knew you had to change it in the dream, is this idea of lucid dreaming. And I don't know if you've heard much about that, but lucid dreaming is it's coming more and more popular, but certain people in the population are naturally lucid dreamers. And what that means is you can, while you're in a dream, sort of be conscious in that dream and actually experience it, but also change it. And it sounds like that's what you were doing. Yeah, and that's amazing. Yeah. And actually, people can kind of train themselves to do it. And lots of people now are looking into this as a way of helping with things like nightmares and other things. But actually, people can find it really fascinating, and it can be like a source of creativity and all sorts of things to try and lucid dream. So there's whole kind of techniques about how to try and get to that place where you can tell yourself you need to teach a spider to computer program.
Yeah, interesting. Actually, somebody, Sasha over here, is saying that is this sort of almost the equivalent of when we change language about, say, like, as she's giving the example of hot flushes, instead of saying about the discomfort of them, we call them power on, power off. So it's sort of like the sleeping version of doing that. But I guess the question is, all right, if we have managed either lucidly or awake to re-envisage the nightmares that may be causing us discomfort, ruining our sleep, and perhaps even contributing to future neural diseases, do we know that that will actually make any difference, or is it still too early to say?
We don't know. We don't know. It's still too early to say. I think there's going to be a lot more research about dreams. There's been some fascinating kind of discoveries about what dreams are, what people can do in dreams. We know for sure that people can do this lucid dreaming. You can actually communicate sometimes with people who are in their dreams. It's so interesting. But I think we need to know more. So we can't say now what it is about nightmares that causes that link with dementia and with Parkinson's. And I think we can't say for sure how we could avoid that. But I think what I hope it does is flag the importance of sleep for cognitive function anyway. So even brain fog, that absolutely such a pervasive symptom of perimenopause and menopause is made much worse by not sleeping very well. And we know that if you can improve your sleep, you can really help with your memory and your cognitive function. So I think it's trying to say, look, let's make sure that we're getting as good a sleep as we can. And if there are things that are not going well with it, try, really flag them up, see what we can do, see if, HRT might help, but often it's other things as well. There are other techniques that you need just to try and get really good quality and enough sleep.
Now, that's an interesting, because that also brings us then to, let's say if we're sleeping, 4 hours and we want to somehow extend that a little bit. Are there any things, I remember we did a chat a little while back about certain foods like kiwi fruit and things like that, that have been shown that they could extend sleep by around about 20 minutes. Are there other, is that enough to make any difference? And are there other things that could actually be useful in extending that period of time that we do sleep?
Yeah, so I think there are foods that can help, and we spoke about those. And I think, again, it really goes back to those habits of setting yourself up. What you do in the day impacts getting enough exercise and activity. So I think before we've talked about this concept of sleep pressure. So the longer you're awake in the day, the more you build up this substance called adenosine in your brain. So you start at 0, you wake up and there's none there. And it's a kind of waste product of activity. And it builds up and up. But you really need lovely high levels of adenosine to fall asleep, but also to stay asleep for a really good amount of time. So we want to make sure people aren't going to bed too early. So it's so tempting to, when you've had a bad night's sleep, to go to bed early. Make sure you're staying up late enough so you've got really good levels of adenosine, but also you need to be active. You need to have social connection. You need to do some kind of activity to really boost those levels. So I think that's really important. And again, I don't mind so much about the waking as long as you can go back to sleep. So, having uninterrupted sleep might just not be possible for some people. As long as we can get back to sleep and thinking about those techniques. And something like cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, if you are not sleeping, if you are getting very short sleeps, or you're waking and not able to get back to sleep, and those other things don't work, something like CBTI can be really useful at kind of increasing the quantity and quality of your sleep.
There's actually one of the other questions that came in was a very poor lady who says that basically for the 10 days before a period, she just does not sleep. She is on HRT. She also happens to be apparently on quite high HRT. What she says is balanced progesterone. I don't know what that means. But nevertheless, if people are experiencing that sort of prior to the periods, just absolutely disrupted sleep, are there things that they can do that would help that? And would it make it, making the difference, taking the progesterone at night, which I'm sure she probably does. A lot of people, if you have it with food, it increases the absorption. So does that mean we're getting too much progesterone then if it increases the absorption, or does it not matter if it gives us a decent night's sleep?
Yeah, so of course, you need to have individual advice from your doctor, but when I'm advising my patients, I normally say that it really doesn't matter about having it with food. So I think the leaflet for the Utrogestan says to have it on an empty stomach with it. You have to not eat for 2 hours before bed. I think that's quite tricky advice for most people anyway. You don't have that much time in your evening and have to space everything out. I think it's tricky advice, but also I think the issue with that is if you have eaten, you absorb more. And for most people, that's helpful. But of course, if you're sensitive to progesterone or you have side effects, that might not be helpful. And you might want to take it on an empty stomach, or as you know, we can use it vaginally or in other ways. But if you're thinking about sleep and if you get on with progesterone, there may be some small benefit to having it with food. We think the absorption is better. So having it with an evening meal is absolutely fine.
And what about if you're using it vaginally? Is that going to make any difference to your sleep or not? Or does it have to be oral?
Yeah, so really the impact is seen with oral use, because it's about that when it's metabolized, it's broken down to this substance called allopregnanolone, which really works on the benzodiazepine receptors in the brain, a little bit like sleeping tablets do, actually. It's quite powerful. And if you have it vaginally, you don't get very much of that. Having said that, there is still possibly a tiny amount produced. And I've certainly seen some women in clinic that say they still get the sleep benefit from progesterone and when they use it vaginally. So I think it's really interesting. Most people don't, but there is a possibility that you might.
Well, look, I mean, even if it's a placebo effect and they're getting a better night's sleep, who cares?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Oh, no, absolutely. And I think that the thing about having the week before your period, having poor sleep, we really see that is the worst time for sleep in the kind of menstrual cycle, this week before. And I think we know that a lot to do with temperature as well. So make sure you're really cooling your room. Our body temperature increases around that time, which can disrupt sleep. So make sure your room is really cool. And then I would actually go down the kind of steps to look at it as a kind of premenstrual syndrome. So when we're thinking about PMS or PMDD treatment, just to make sure we're really ticking the boxes, that the hormones are as stabilized as they can be. So if you do get that cycle variation, sometimes it's helpful not to have a cycle, and actually using something like the Mirena coil can kind of help switch that off. And there are other things to do as well. So I'd think about it in that way.
This is an interesting one, actually, especially when we come to people with anxiety and PMS, progesterone intolerance, and those sorts of things, and depressive tendencies. Is Utrogestin vaginally and the Mirena coil probably the best option in that case, or are they better off on orally or patch, or what are the, or is it a matter of
Yeah, I think again it is such a spectrum, and I think you have to have with women who are struggling like that, so if they're sensitive to progesterone, PMS, PMDD, which they do often come together, you have to take everyone as an individual. There's just not a good one size fits all answer there. So I almost see it as like having a whole menu of options, and you say, right, what have you tried in the past? How did that go? How were you with the pill? How were you with this? What do you feel about the Mirena coil? What do you feel about this? And you have to try different things. So the Mirena coil can be absolutely brilliant because it can switch off the periods, brilliant, and you get very little absorbed, but still some women will be sensitive to that small amount of absorption. And you have some women for whom vaginal Utrogestin does the trick, and that's it, that's brilliant. But again, you have some, and I've had some that are just better on a synthetic progestogen. It is so hard to know. So I think it's such an individual thing. But I think the important thing to know there is there are lots of different options to think about. But it is a bit of a journey. It's a journey of figuring it out.
It always is, isn't it? See, I'm on Utrogestin now after having the Mirena coil removed, and they won't give it back to me because I'm too old. And I know, don't even ask.
Okay.
It just makes no sense whatsoever.
No.
3 months worth of bleeding, 2 ultrasounds later, kilos of Utrogestin, which made me unbelievably snappy. 2 Utrogestins is enough for me to want to kill anybody in sight. So I'm now doing 1 orally and 1 vaginally.
Oh, yes. I've got some people that love that as well. It's really funny, isn't it? Yeah, that just makes the difference. And do you get sleep benefit, or do you?
Yes, I do. I'm getting a sleep benefit, and I'm not quite as likely to kill my husband today.
Best of both worlds. That's really good. Although we need to campaign about that, Mirena. That's scandalous.
I know, because this is the thing. It's on the HRT. I mean, because basically what they're saying is, your GP can give you one if they're trained to give you one, but they're like hen's teeth, as my mother would have said. So that means you have to go to the sexual health clinic, and it's not funded at the sexual health clinic unless it's for contraception purposes. So how much have I now cost the health system with 2 ultrasounds and God only knows what else, when I could have had one of them slapped in 5 years again and and away you go. We have a couple of questions here, and one of them is CBD in sleep. What do we think?
Yeah. So, interestingly, the evidence for it specifically for sleep isn't very good, but I don't think that should necessarily put you off. So, I think that for CBD and sleep does not seem to help. If you're measuring the sleep and you look at the kind of other measurements where they do a polysomnogram overnight and they kind of strap you up and look at your brain waves and the amount of sleep you're getting, CBD doesn't seem to make much difference. Okay. But what we do think it's quite good for is anxiety. And anxiety and sleep are so linked. It is the closest relationship that we see, because if you're anxious, your body is just not set up to sleep in that state. It makes evolutionary sense. If you're worried, you're fearful, it's not a good time to kind of put your defenses down and make yourself vulnerable by sleeping. And so if CBD helps with anxiety, I can see how it would help with sleep as well. So I think it's one of those suck it and see, but it's got a potential mechanism. But if you're just using it for sleep alone, we can't say that it's going to help.
Yeah. And another question here, speaking of the anxiety, can I increase my Everol in times of anxiety? Will it help, as anxiety was part of my postmenopausal issues along with massive brain fog? This whole sort of like, I'm going to adapt my estrogen and my HRT levels by myself along with my cycle is something that always sends mild shivers down my spine.
Yeah, I don't like it either. So firstly, it's always better to speak to somebody about your dose. So speak to your clinician about it. But secondly, I think adjustments that are made based on something happening, something else happening, are never good. It's all exactly everything to do with hormones. The way the brain feels about hormones is it just wants stability. That's part of the problem in PMS and PMDD, is that we can be sensitive to the variation. It's not the absolute level. It is about how much variation there is and our personal sensitivity to that. So I think for me, stability is the way forward. Now, if you need a higher dose, then you should discuss having a higher dose, but adjusting it kind of here and there, I don't think there's any evidence, and certainly in my experience, I don't like that really. And I think that it's not that, it'd be lovely to think that estrogen, you use it and you feel happier or you'll feel less anxious, but it's not really how it works. It's about getting the estrogen levels right for your body, and then things are going to happen around that. We're going to feel anxious at times, we're going to feel sad, we're going to feel happy, but we just need to get those levels right for our body. And I think it normally is about stable levels.
Yeah. Another question that came in, you mentioned before about meds. Are there certain meds that make a difference to our sleep quality? One of the questions was about beta blockers. I would have thought actually beta blockers probably would have made you sleep better. But
beta blockers, it's a really good point. That's actually a classic that can disrupt your sleep and can cause nightmares. So beta blockers are something to consider. So they're commonly known to have sleep side effects. The other big group that you would think would help but can sometimes be harmful to sleep are the antidepressants. So particularly the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. You would think if something's helping with your mood and helping you feel less anxious, it's going to be good for sleep, but it isn't always. And lots of them can cause insomnia, particularly at the beginning of treatment, which is a real pain. Sometimes it all settles down, so we don't need to react too quickly. Watch and see what happens. But they can also make sleep a little bit lighter as well. So it's if you're not sleeping well and you're on an antidepressant, it's definitely worth thinking about that.
Yeah. And are there ones then you could ask to change to that wouldn't have those effects?
Yeah, so there are some antidepressants that are better for sleep. And so it depends what your sort of main problem is. I'd always want to look, how has your depression been? What sort of thing is going to help with that? But if you're mainly looking to help with sleep, there are antidepressants that are better. So something called trazodone is particularly good, and something called mirtazapine. But again, everything has its pros and cons.
Yeah, but God, it's such a complex balancing act, isn't it? Yeah. Just looking at the other questions here that have I covered them all? Paralysis meds. Other meds apart from the SSRIs and beta blockers. Anything else that people should bear in mind?
I think they're the two most common. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's all the questions that came in. Heard too, it's hard to dose HRT during perimenopause because of the estrogen volatility. Is that correct? I mean, in the end, you're sort of flattening it out, and you're looking for that symptoms to react and then adjusting until you get that form of balance, really, aren't you?
Yeah, yeah. So in the perimenopause, because often, you're young, you've been used to quite high levels. Quite often you do need high levels. And if you think about your background, and when I say high, I just mean within the licensed dose range. But when you think about what's happening in the background, you've got these kind of wiggles and they're really chaotic and it's high and it's low. But what we want to do with HRT is stabilize. So it's not like in postmenopause when you're wanting to replace and top it up. So the way I would look at it is you want to pick a level that's going to basically be just about above most of your variation. So your background variation is here. You're going to pick a level that just evens it out. Now, you might get a few spikes that go above that. And, there's very little you can do about that. But really to try and pick enough that you just get a nice steady level that's just above your own variation. And for most people, you can find that by just going up gradually and seeing what feels right.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything else that we need to think about with sleep here? Do we think we've covered it all?
I think we've done quite a good job there, haven't we?
I think we have, actually. But I mean, I guess the take-home message out of that is that if you are having nightmares and all those sorts of things, you don't have to worry that you are necessarily going to develop dementia or Parkinson's. If you are having nightmares and things, there are steps you can take to actually turn those dreams around and make them functional, like teaching a funnel how to use a computer. Yeah, there is control that we have over these sorts of things, and we can improve the quality of our life and our sleep with making sure that we get exercise, that we get light in the morning, that we eat well, eat kiwi fruit and increase the duration of your sleep. Avoid too much alcohol, avoid caffeine if we can. And I think that's sort of about it, really, isn't it?
And ask for help. If these things aren't working, don't struggle on. Do ask for help.
Yeah. And the other important piece of news is you are booked in and coming to the Pause conference in November at the end of the year, I believe.
Yes, I am so excited about that. That's so brilliant. And actually, we haven't quite finalised the plan yet, but we're thinking about doing a joint session with myself and my sister, who's a clinical psychologist.
You are doing a joint session because I'm the one who's writing them up. That's what
fantastic. Excellent. I think, we're so excited. It sounds like it's going to be an amazing event. It's huge, isn't it? It's really huge.
It will be, just so people don't know what it is at the end of the year. The people who run, the background of these people is they used to do all of the aesthetics industry conferences that happen, every couple of times a year. And then she sold the aesthetics industry conference thing and has decided to do menopause conferences going through. So at the beginning of the year, I went to one of theirs and chaired a session, and it was menopause in aesthetics. So it was for aesthetics doctors. And from there, they have now decided to do one for consumers. So that's at the 25th of November this year. And also one coming up for GPs. So my role in helping them is to make sure they get as much evidence-based stuff there as is humanly possible. And to make sure then that everybody gets the best information they can possibly get. So yes, when it came to sleep, I was thinking, I know who you've got to have Zoe, and you've got to have a sister. So
thank you. Yeah, I think it's so, and I think we're going to make it. We're really going to think about making that super practical. We've never done such a big event before, so we're going to make it super practical, super helpful. I really hope it'll be a really good session. So thank you.
It will be, I hope. So if people want to know, but I think it's called, I can't even remember, I'm organising it. What's it called? Pause IA. So
Pause Live, isn't it?
Pause Live. So jump on. I'll put it up in the thingy afterwards. It will be a good thing, and there'll be lots of people there, lots of brilliant speakers, lots of educational bits, lots of entertainment bits. It'll be a fully formed day.
It looks amazing.
Yeah. Excellent. And in the meantime, Possum, where do people find you should they need you?
I'm at on Instagram. I'm at Zoe Menopause Doctor, Dr. Zoe Menopause Doctor. I'm at Myla Health. So Myla Health is a private women's health clinic, and you can find that on www.mylahealth.co.uk.
Brilliant. And thank you for that. And hopefully I will see and speak to you well before November anyway.
Yeah, brilliant. Look forward to it, Fiona. Thank you. See you.
Thank you. Take care. I shall end this now up here.